Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Derek Briggs. I'm the president of the National Council on Measurement and Education, NCME. For those of you who may be attending an NCME event for the first time, we hope you will consider joining us for more such great events in the future by becoming a member. And I want to give a special plug for the upcoming NCME annual conference that will be held April 21st through 24th in San Diego. NCME is a professional organization for individuals involved in assessment, evaluation, testing, and other aspects of educational measurement. Members are involved in the construction and use of standardized tests, new forms of assessment, including performance-based assessment, program design, and program evaluation. NCME members include university faculty, test developers, state and federal testing and research directors, professional evaluators, testing specialists in business, industry, education, community programs, and other professions, licensure, certification, and credentialing professionals, graduate students from educational, psychological, and other measurement programs, and others involved in testing issues and practices. The mission of NCME is to work together to advance theory and applications of educational measurement to benefit society. During the past 20 years, as NCME membership has become more diverse, this has served to broaden the scope of the organization's vision. In particular, service to communities and ensuring that assessments are fair and equitable for all students are assuming an ever-increasing emphasis in our members' activities. And it's with this in mind that I'm so proud to introduce you to one of my presidential initiatives, the first annual Equity in Assessment and Measurement webinar. The goals for the webinar are to put a spotlight on the way that the NCME community is taking up or could be taking up issues of equity and social justice in the context of assessment and measurement, to engage members of the NCME community in discussion and debate, and to provide a forum for learning. Today's webinar is entitled Cultural Relevance versus Construct Relevance. How do we create culturally responsive assessments? And with that, I will pass the baton to Jennifer Lee.
Thank you so much, Derek. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to get ready to share our presentation with you all. So once again, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as we discuss and hopefully dismantle the notion that cultural relevance and construct relevance are opposing forces when it comes to developing culturally responsive assessments. I am Jennifer Lee. I serve as the Director of Assessment and Evaluation for Capstone Institute at Howard University, and I have an expert panelist here joining me today, and we invite you to ask them questions using the Q&A function, and we'll respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. I want to talk a little bit about who those esteemed colleagues of mine are, who they are, and the work that they're doing. We're going to start with Dr. Molly Faulkner-Bond. She's a senior research associate at WestEd. At WestEd, Dr. Faulkner-Bond engages in both research and technical assistance activities, all of which are designed to increase the use of utility of educational research results, substantially impact teaching and learning, and improve educational outcomes for linguistically and culturally diverse learners. We also have Dr. Fiona Hines, who is an equity and social justice advocate with extensive experience in education management, innovation, and strategic planning. Her expertise includes the examination, development, and transformation of current practices to create equitable systems that support diverse learners. Dr. Hines currently serves as a senior advisor, equity and transformation at Cognia. Next, we have Dr. Katie McClarty. She's the Vice President of Research and Design at Renaissance. She has extensive expertise in assessment design along with K-12 educational and research policy. We also have Dr. Chastity McFarland, who is the Content Quality Manager at Renaissance. She oversees the process of ensuring content development across Renaissance worldwide portfolio of products is not only fair and appropriate, but also inclusive, equitable, and representative. Last but not least, we have Dr. Akuma Nwandiki, who is a scholar, research practitioner, and founder of Inclusivity Education. She uses her research-based best practices and originally designed evaluative frameworks and models to advocate for design, implement, and measure inclusivity development. Before we go further, I want to just operationally define some of the key terms that you're going to hear about this afternoon. Two of them are culturally relevant pedagogy, as well as culturally responsive teaching. Culturally relevant pedagogy, sometimes referred to as culturally relevant teaching, is defined as a theoretical model that not only addresses student achievement, but also helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity while developing critical perspectives that challenge the inequities that schools and other institutions perpetuate. And this is operationally defined by Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings. Culturally responsive teaching, on the other hand, utilizes that same cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, as well as performance styles of other ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for those students. And this was operationally defined by Gay. Both culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching have many features in common, and they're often used interchangeably. Although culturally relevant pedagogy is often viewed as a theoretical framework and a mindset, while culturally responsive teaching is viewed as the action of revising our systems so that they center students and actually meet the students' needs. Culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogies are concerned with liberatory teaching so that instruction and learners gain an understanding of the social, political, historical knowledge, the social, political, and the historical knowledge to challenge and critique society. Both culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching aim to improve the academic success of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of color while affirming their backgrounds, experiences, and identities. Another set of terms that you'll hear used quite often this afternoon is universal design for learning and for assessment. Universal design for learning has a goal of, let me back up a little bit. Let's start with the universal design of assessments first. So the goal of universal design assessment principles is actually to improve access to assessments for all students. The principles of universal design for learning is a scientific framework for guiding education practices, again, to have a further reach for all students and access and equity for all students. So one is more focused on educational practices, lesson planning, unit planning, and so forth, where the universal design for assessment, again, focuses more on the assessments. The principles of UDL, they're similar to the principles of UDA, although universal design assessment specifically focuses on, again, as I mentioned, assessments and ensuring that they support valid results for interpretations. Now we're going to transition to some of the key questions that we have today for our expert panelists. And I'm going to start with, there are 4 questions. And the first question that we have this afternoon focuses on, well, let me just start with giving you an overview of the questions. So these are the 4, and then we're going to start with an opening question. Is culture considered construct relevant? And we're going to have our panelists start with responding to that question. Is culture considered construct relevant or construct irrelevant?
Excellent.
And so I'm going to pause, and Katie or Molly, would you like to respond for us?
Yep, I will start if you want to flip to the next slide. I am going to use the universal design for assessment as a framework to start the discussion about whether culture is really construct relevant, drawing on the paper from CCSSO and the National Center for Educational Outcomes, Sandra Thompson, Christopher Johnstone, Martha Thurlow, put out, and they cite 7 principles in their report, but for the sake of time and conversation, I'm only going to highlight 3 of those today. So if you want to click on the next slide, the first element that I'm going to talk about is that the need for a clearly defined construct. And that's something that we already debate today in education, separate from some of these equity questions. Thompson et al. Used the example of, whether reading comprehension is limited to written text, or if it actually, is it constructing meaning from written text, or is it just constructing meaning, targeting comprehension without that specific limit on how the information is obtained, because that larger definition is really important to allow for read aloud or other listening options, which are common accommodations for students with disabilities, with visual impairments. Another common construct challenge, if you'll click again, involves reading skills in mathematics items, right? Several studies have shown that students with reading difficulties score higher on math assessments when the questions were read to them, implying that their low reading ability is interfering with our ability to, accurately, validly measure the mathematics that they know. However, current standards often, require reading in our items in order to make sense of problems or to, model with mathematics in real world scenarios. So to address this, some have called for a simplified language or a very common context to limit the impact of reading skill. What I'd like to layer on top of this, if you click again, is just say, how does culture interact with these construct definitions? So in reading, these standards I put up here about central idea and themes and word definitions and tone, those can be assessed through a variety of text choices. And so the question is, which texts, which words do we choose to put in our assessments, and whose culture do they privilege? And in math, where the standards call for students to explain the meaning of a problem, to look for entry points to the solution, apply mathematics to solve problems, quote, arising in everyday life, society, and the workplace, the question is, which problems do we include? Which of those everyday life, society, and workplace challenges are we creating in our assessment? And are those common problems different or more relevant for students from some cultures or from certain backgrounds? The second element I want to talk about, if you switch again, is this one on creating accessible, non-biased items. That was element 3 in the framework. And I've included 2 of the considerations here that I think are pretty common to test developers, right? We don't want out-of-school factors, socioeconomic status, personal characteristics to influence whether or not students can answer a question correctly. We really want to focus on the construct and having these non-biased items. But again, I ask the question, where does cultural background fit in? You can click, right? It's not specifically called out in these slides or in these definitions, but is it something we should consider? Is it something we should try to eliminate? And is that even possible, right? So the authors of the paper note that when you're trying to apply universal design for assessments, we're really trying to go for balance, because changes that could make an item more accessible for some students might actually make it less accessible for other students. And I think that's the same situation here in culture. And when we think about culture and how we try to find a balance in our assessment, because some might privilege some cultures over others, and how do we balance that? The last element I want to touch on just briefly is number 6 in the framework, the maximum readability and comprehensibility. In the paper, again, authors call out things like the importance of previous experience, and we've seen that, right? The importance of background knowledge in reading, as well as citing researchers that talk about the importance of using everyday words as much as possible. And again, to me, it begs the question about where culture fits in. If you click it up there, which experiences get included, or do we assume that all students have had? And historically, we've done a lot of content review committees, or we've done diff analyses to try to get rid of the ones that I would say are obvious ones. But I think some of the less obvious ones appear when we talk about whose language gets represented, and with a focus on sort of the simple, the common words, the common experiences, the common approaches. That focus on common can lead to the less diversity and inclusion in our assessments. And I'll turn it over to Molly to keep talking about that.
Thanks, Katie. Great points. And so just based on what Katie has shared, I want to just underscore and be a little more explicit about sort of 2 key ideas that I think are relevant for this conversation. So they have to do with the role that culture does or does not play in assessment currently, and then also just a little more about differentiating between universal design for assessment versus universal design for learning. So next slide. So regarding the first point, I just want to push us as a field to make sure we're being really thoughtful about the role of culture in assessments, both now and in the future. I think a common belief we have is that, particularly if we are following the joint standards, if we are using the UDA standards, if we are, kind of doing our best assessment work, then we can produce assessments that are culture free. And the work we do in terms of reviewing them for bias and sensitivity produces items in the end that are neutral and don't reflect any particular culture. Next slide. So if through this lens, then the question about culture and assessment becomes one of adding something in that's not currently there. So we go from having no culture to suddenly having culture in our assessments. So next slide, I actually am compelled by arguments that have been made that what we really have currently are assessments that reflect white culture, and particularly upper middle class white culture. And the fact that we view this as no culture is just a reflection of the dynamic that other scholars who are more expert than I, but have already argued about the way whiteness sort of renders itself invisible by sort of hiding in plain sight as the sort of normal or the default. And so white culture is seen as no culture or as neutral. And so other things then become sort of deviations from that, and they are deemed culture, whereas white culture is not. And if you adopt this view, next slide, then the task at hand shifts not from adding in something that isn't there, but rather in diversifying something that's already there so that it reflects more people. And essentially, and I think the urgency of the question shifts then too, because it's not, would it be a good thing for us to do to add culture to assessments where there is none, but rather, should we try to do for all students what we are currently doing for some students, whether we mean to or not? I certainly don't mean to imply that we're, intentionally creating white assessments or that anyone is doing this out of sort of malice or a lack of care. But I think, in fact, this is often what happens. And if you do take this view, it doesn't necessarily make the task at hand any easier. I think it's still many of the points that Katie raised are still there. How do we make sure that everyone can access all the items and feels comfortable? But I think the stakes of the question are different if you view things this way. Next slide. And the other thing, and sorry, just to follow that up, I just want to emphasize too that students notice these things. So I'm just going to share two quick quotations from some focus groups I did with students over the summer with my colleague Darius Taylor, where they were shown kind of pairs of items where one item was really making a concerted effort to try to show more diverse students. And one 8th grade student said afterwards, I really appreciated the diversity in this item. I thought it was really cool to include everybody instead of just having one specific group of people. Another student, next slide, also said she was really struggling because she liked the item that was not attempting to be more diverse, but she really appreciated the fact that there was diversity in this other item. And she said, I'm not trying to be offensive, but there are mainly white people on these tests. So I appreciate how they had the diversity. So students do notice these things. And, I think that is a sign that, even with our best efforts, we are maybe producing something that isn't reflective of everybody. I'll be quick in my last point. I also just want to circle back to the distinction between universal design for assessment versus universal design for learning on the next slide. And I think that we often go to universal design for assessment in our community. Obviously, it makes sense. It's focused on how to ensure that assessment results are valid. But I think we actually have a lot that we could potentially learn and use from universal design for learning. I am not an expert on this, but what I have learned from interacting with Bob Dolan and Carol Lytusis, who recently started a special interest group trying to think about bringing UDL and assessment and measurement together, is in many ways that UDL can actually help us expand how we design assessment. So rather than kind of stripping things out or taking things away, how can we leverage these ideas of multiple means of engagement, of representation, and of action and expression to create more access and entry points for students, and try to think as a community, as an assessment community, how can we use these things to create assessments that are ultimately more engaging for more diverse learners. So I will pass it back to Jennifer to continue to our next question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie and Molly. And now we have our next question. How might the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy look when applied to assessments? And I'm going to start with Chastity.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So you can advance that slide. I thought I'd give a quick overview of the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy before jumping into the response. So few decades ago, Gloria Ladson-Billings observed the classroom practices of teachers of academically successful African-American students. And she identified 3 commonalities across the classroom shown on the screen. And these became known as what I refer to as the central tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy. So essentially, when implemented with fidelity, culturally relevant pedagogy produces academically successful students, students who demonstrate cultural competence, and students who demonstrate socio-political consciousness. So what does that mean? Next, the first tenet states that students experience academic success, which we can probably agree is a pretty standard expectation in any educational framework. But what's unique about culturally relevant pedagogy is that students are still learning the same reading, writing, and math concepts, but they're doing it in a context, format, and style that's relevant to them. And I say reading, writing, and math, but it extends to all subjects. So if we're applying this tenet to assessments, then it should lead us to question whether we're allowing students to demonstrate their understanding of reading, writing, and math concepts in a way that's relevant to them. And if we're not affording them this opportunity, then we have to question the traditional format of assessments. Yes, multiple choice question items are convenient and efficient, but perhaps this format privileges certain types of learners. Perhaps some best demonstrate their understanding through written essays or presentations or portfolios of various projects. So I think applying this academic success tenet to assessments means giving students the agency to demonstrate their understanding in a way that's relevant to them. And this second tenet, cultural competence, it refers to the appreciation and celebration of one's own culture while gaining knowledge of at least one other culture. So when we're applying this to assessments, students should be able to see their culture and the cultures of others validated and affirmed. And maybe this starts with increasing surface level diversity and swapping out a character named Sally for one named Yesenia. And to be clear, this is not sufficient in itself, but normalizing cultural diversity and allowing students to see themselves in the material is important and not as common as it should be in this day and age. And it's something that can be done today. It's something that could have been done yesterday, quite frankly. Then as we develop our own cultural competence, we can ramp up our efforts and we can dig deeper into the content and explore how to make it more meaningful, more engaging, more relevant. And we might ask ourselves, what day-to-day activities are characters performing in contextual items? What foods and customs are featured? We can dig even deeper and question which historical figures are students presented with in reading passages. From what perspective are historical events told? Whose stories are being told and whose are being silenced? These are the questions that we will grapple with as we apply this tenet to the content of assessments. And the third tenet is interesting because it's the most debated, but it's the least implemented. So socio-political consciousness refers to students' awareness of the systems and structures in place that impact their lives. And the objective here is to empower students to change these systems in a way that has a positive impact on their communities. So this is where we touch on topics that many adults, especially adults from different cultures as their students, quite honestly are hesitant to discuss. For instance, we may touch on inequities in school funding based on property value, or we may talk about zoning regulations that allow for liquor stores near schools in certain neighborhoods, but not others. We can even add book censorship to that list these days. We know that the inclusion of meaningful topics make for engaging discussions in the classroom. But at the same time, we also acknowledge that including these topics directly contradict the content guidelines for assessments that we have. I do think this tenet needs to be further explored in assessments, and I plan to circle back to that later in this webinar. But we do need an understanding of how we can continue pushing students to develop their socio-political consciousness while ensuring we're not invoking an unintended emotional response.
Thank you, Chastity. Akuma?
Sure. So I'm gonna, I guess, build on what Chastity shared. The title of my slide at the top to give you all context. I was an English major and English teacher, so I love words. So the idea of optics and topics having the same letters was dazzling to me, but it worked very well for explaining what culture relevant pedagogy is supposed to do. And that the idea that it really, if you're reading into it, it is much more about topics than optics. And what I mean by that is being transparent. We know that almost still 90% of teaching staff at the K-12 level is white, right? Whereas we're watching our student body become much more students of color, pushing 50%. And some of the pushback that you can get for instituting more culturally relevant pedagogy in the classroom is that lack of racial affinity. Can I do this work if I'm white and I'm teaching all Black kids or Black and brown kids? And with what Chastity was sharing with us is really understanding the difference in what you're supposed to be doing in this work, and that it's not just about the racial affinity with the students, though that does help, and we do still want to diversify our teaching staff, but till we get to that promised land, what can we do now? So this is what I'm going to break down here for you first in these points, and then dive deeper into them. And especially this term critical consciousness, which is you'll hear throughout culturally relevant pedagogy work. But that actual term stems back to Paulo Freire, if you've ever heard or read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the idea of this being about not just raising your awareness about something, but then what actions are you taking about it? So we know over the last year or two, everyone's been listening and learning, but at what point do you stop listening and learning and do, right? So this is what this work is asking you to do. So one of the first things to do in an assessment setting is really developing that critical consciousness within educators in a way that centers culture, language, and experiences that reflect the student body. And a simple understanding I give to people about this is it's the difference between a Black Superman and Black Panther, right? One is really embodying the culture of that group versus we just slap the Black face on a traditionally white face, or we changed out a name, or we put them in New York City as opposed to Oklahoma, but everything else about the story is the same, right? So if you're going to change the race, you're changing the culture and the ethnicity, sort of circling back to what Katie was sharing with us earlier, so that the students truly see their entirety reflected and not just the face of the person being reflected. That really has been shown to already help increase success for students of color, because now they can attach their lived experiences to what they are learning about. And this is that idea of culture being for everybody, right? So not whiteness being a standard, but there also being a white culture, the same way that every other ethnicity has a culture, and being able to recognize, accept that, and give everybody something that they need. Often we find that there are much more convergence in culture than divergences. And so these are not actually opposing things, but these are something that everybody can get from. And a lot of researchers will tell you that the more specific you get about culture, the more universal it actually does become. When you build with everybody in mind from the beginning, you actually don't hit anybody. But when you target a very specific group, everybody can get something out of it. It's why a movie like Parasite, that is South Korean, still resonated very well in America, because you're like, but I still see my culture somewhere in this very specific culture. And that's what this work is supposed to do. The third bullet is my favorite in a lot of ways. It's making new culture mainstream. So the idea of when we're looking at assessments, how do we make sure that at the point where we infuse certain things so deeply that they become mainstream? I think I keep using a New York City reference because of where I was raised, but the term bodega, right, is not an American term. It's very much a Latin American term, but everyone in New York City calls the corner store the bodega, right? It has become a mainstream topic. So if you do this to assessments long enough at some point that we're not switching out what word does this culture use, but it becomes a universal term the same way that minoritized people have had to learn white universal terms. So how do we put these new cultures in deeply enough to assessments? And what that ends up facilitating is this idea of inclusion, comfort, and validation. So not that we have 5 different assessments to represent the 5 different ethnicities in our classroom, but you all could be taking the same assessment created for the South Asian students, and we've all mainstreamed this knowledge. So that's really what we want to do in the assessment part. One of the ultimate ways to do this is the controversy around the 4th bullet, that if we're honest with ourselves that the way his assessments have historically been treated So even thinking about Chassie's point about moving away from multiple choice, is that assessments test students on what they do not know versus what they do know, right? How many did you get wrong, as opposed to focusing on what they got right, right? I had the perfectionist parents. You bring home a 97, where are the other 3 points? But what about everything else that I got correct here, right? And this is based in understanding the eugenicist backgrounds of where assessments came from, this perfectionism, but it also internalizes the racism, because often a lot of those questions on standardized tests or even school tests that students don't get is not a lack of knowledge, it's a culture gap. I really didn't know what that term meant or what that word is. I use the term very often that I didn't know what a corridor was growing up because I lived in an apartment. What's a corridor? So if that was in an assessment, I may get that question wrong. So how are we focusing on what students do know and building assessments around that using more universal language? That's where you make those tweaks and changes to your assessment. Really thinking about, is this word going to be a cultural shakeup? So how do we make sure we're doing that? And then building on where do we do this across a K-12 or even pre-K-12 spectrum? Gloria Ladson-Billings will tell you that you're supposed to be doing culturally responsive teaching as young as like 2nd grade, but do you throw socio-political awareness at a 7-year-old, right? So really wanting to consider, how do you actually scaffold this knowledge in a way that makes it possible to do all the things that culture relevant pedagogy is supposed to do, but knowing that you do not have to do all 3 in one. And especially thinking about this for the teachers themselves. Elementary school teachers are also not ready to bring out roots for a 7-year-old, right? Like that's a lot. So where do we actually start this in assessment? So we really would focus with the younger grades, elementary, maybe early middle, doing more of inclusion, comfort, validation work. How do we actually make sure that these assessments reflect who you are here, so that when you bring this home to your family, they can help you, they understand the terminology. We all know that there was that age level where your parents couldn't help you anymore. We want to push that away. And if we really think about inclusion and comfort and validation, it gets away from that eugenicist background. It makes it so that I understand that I'm not developing any type of internalized racism or my culture is being treated less than when we do any work in school. Once they built that sort of solid foundation, that confidence in who they are, at the point where they're getting into later middle grades and into high school, now we're ready to really push that socio-political consciousness, right? Being able to criticize what has been normalized to you. Maybe now they're able to recognize some of those gaps in assessments and be part of that process, because CRP is really supposed to be a ground up process. So if we build that confidence into students really young, then as they get older, it's not just asking a panel of experts, what does this look like? It's asking kids, what should be in your assessment? What is actually fair? And how do you become part of this process? So it's sort of a theory mixed with like empiricism, because people almost don't want to do it because they don't want to see that it can work. But there is an actual model for what this should look like if applied successfully. And that is the end of my soapbox. So I will turn it over to Jennifer again.
Thank you, Dr. Akuma. Our next question, I would like to pose it to Fiona. Start with you.
Okay. Next slide. So I'd like to begin with saying that when we're considering what is culturally relevant, we're really considering students at the center of our work, and students in terms of their identity and in terms of their culture. Next slide. And when we think about cultural relevance as a key to supporting and assessing underrepresented learners, we also understand that cultural relevance as a lens provides social justice for all students and context for social justice for all students. This is a basic foundation in understanding that identity and culture are essential to the processes of learning. And so we specifically point out the fact that understanding social context, as Akuma pointed out, also in terms of those details and nuances of the experiences of students and the experiences of our historically underrepresented students, this factor becomes an opportunity to elevate not only learning, but our assessment practices, and becomes a key factor to expanding equity in our assessments. This also makes opportunities for understanding who our students are and asking the question before we begin our work and as we apply our work, asking the question who our students are based on their experiences related to cultural norms, related to their interactions and their identity. This is where we have an opportunity to build those kinds of connections so that we can understand what cultural relevance actually is and move forward with developing how to apply cultural relevance as a practice for supporting and understanding learning. When student cultures and identities are valued, we provide context for the integration of new knowledge related to the connections that are significant to how students relate to new knowledge. And this is something that Hammond has explored and also describes as making connections with cultural norms, beliefs, and a way of being, and connecting that and applying that intentionally to the assessment practices that we integrate. Next slide. Cultural relevance itself is centers. When we center students, we understand that students are valued, that they're engaged, and they're empowered. And so applying this intentional process provides us with an opportunity to elevate and empower students so that they have so that they are validated, they're engaged authentically, and they're empowered to advocate for themselves and to advocate for social justice. These practices integrated provide all students with an opportunity to reflect on understanding equity and social justice. The actions taken to develop culturally responsive educational practices are also described by Jerry Thompson as a shared responsibility for culturally responsive, sustaining education. And this discussion also focuses on the opportunity for culturally responsive, sustaining practices, which support experiences and also the power dynamics that privilege dominant groups. These are also disrupted when we provide opportunities to integrate cultural relevance. We also see students as agents for social change and an opportunity to not only see themselves as empowered, but to see communities as well as equitable power dynamics within the context of their lives. This particularly elevates voices that we have not heard and that we have not focused on in terms of our historically marginalized students. And we have an opportunity to foster achievement through this practice. Next slide. Addressing cultural relevance is an intentional act. It is something that we need to focus on as a practice. And if we are not focusing on it as a practice, we revert back to the general traditional principles that provide opportunities specifically for the dominant culture. So what we need to do is we need to be able to leverage and utilize guiding principles to lead the review and determination of our work. And first and foremost, these principles are framed by keeping the students at the center of what we do, at the center of our guiding frameworks. And when we address cultural relevance, we're focused on supporting all students and building value, visibility, and empowerment into our tools and assessments for students that have been traditionally underrepresented and social justice consciousness for all students. We understand that learning is cultural, contextual, and that the social constructs in which we live impact our perspectives and impact our work. We acknowledge the social context in which students live and the influence that this has on learning and assessment processes and practices. When we address cultural relevance, we're listening to the experience of students, educators, and specific communities that have not been heard. And we're listening for ways that we can support and connect learning and best practices to the use of assessment data for the purpose of improving learning and providing equitable practices for all students to increase levels of engagement. Framing cultural relevance is also positional for a social justice framework. And this is an ongoing practice that gives us an opportunity to change and transform the practices that we implement, eyeing the outcomes for a design that is equitable and that addresses cultural relevance. These types of guiding principles lead us towards change, enhancement, and an opportunity to move towards a more equitable framework. We can use these guiding principles first and foremost by keeping students at the center of our work, listening to students and educators, supporting transformation and transforming our practices. Next slide. This is an example of some work that we are currently doing to support engaging the community in the process of item development. And so there are very few models documented that relate specifically to how we can address and engage community in order to focus and understand cultural context and identity as a method for item development. And I just like to share these two particular research projects that are in the beginning phases that we have been working in collaboration with Susan Lyons and Boston Public Schools, as well as Western New Mexico, in order to develop culturally relevant items. Boston Public Schools certainly has been focusing on how to support and leverage an anti-racist curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And we are going to have the opportunity to gather input specifically from teachers and students as it relates to relevant content that is reflective of the experiences and cultures of students. And we also are working with Western New Mexico University to specifically engage the community in a development process so that we will create a framework for input, feedback from the community so that the content is reflective of community values as well as empowering students. We'll certainly be looking forward to sharing the results of these practices with you, and we certainly believe that there is a role for the community in the development and understanding of culture and identity and engagement, not as an opportunity to share with communities our expertise, but to listen and to understand a sense of belonging and support for learning practices and assessment through this process.
Thank you, Fiona. Katie? Or I'm sorry, Molly.
No worries. So yeah, just to continue on what Fiona has shared so eloquently, I think another sort of thread for this question was sort of how do we know if when our assessments are being culturally relevant versus to sort of echo a question we received, how can we be sure that our representations are authentic, that they're landing with students, that we're not, resorting to stereotype? How can we know if we're doing this well? So I'm going to share a few more findings from the focus groups I mentioned earlier, which we conducted in partnership with an organization that is interested in making a very thoughtful effort to try to overhaul their assessment development practices. They've been working to revise their guidelines to change the way they rate items, and they were really interested in bringing in some student voice, next slide, to try and get feedback on sort of, is this working? And also, how will students react if we try to show them items like these ones that we're trying to develop? So they invited us in partnership to do some focus groups with students, almost as a proof of concept in one way. So one big question was just, does it work to show items to students? Do they have useful things to say? Can we engage with them about this? And then also, if that works, what do we learn if we actually talk to the students we are trying to reach with these changes? Next slide. So I just want to emphasize this was a very small pilot study. It was a proof of concept. So we had a pretty small sample. It was 14 students across 2 different focus groups. We recruited them. It was a convenient sample. So through word of mouth, social media networks, professional networks. But we had a pretty thorough sign-up process where we asked students and their parents to share what they felt comfortable with us about their identities and why they wanted to participate. The majority of the participants were female. The majority identified as some kind of non-white identity. And then most of them were from California, but we did have students from across the country. We also did ask them their zip codes because we wanted to try to get some socioeconomic diversity. And since we did go through our own networks, we knew that we were probably going to be biased towards sort of wealthier and more educated networks. So we really did try to ensure that we had students from a range of backgrounds. In these sessions, what we did is we thought for a while about how we wanted to talk to students, and we decided not to be overly explicit about asking them, what do you see about race and culture in this item? Or what do you think about the representation? We really decided we just want to hear, what do you see? What do you notice? What do you not notice? In part because we thought it would be of interest if the students didn't necessarily notice certain elements that had been put in there to try to be more relevant or responsive. I think one concern that people sometimes have is this is going to be alienating for some students, this is going to be upsetting for some students, this is going to be confusing for some students. And so rather than direct their attention, we just wanted to hear, what do you see and how do you feel about it? So I'm going to very brief overview, next slide. In terms of what the students noticed, one thing, I think a general theme we saw is that students are very savvy test takers. And so one thing that they notice above all else is how quickly can I solve this item? And so they were very sensitive to passage length and task complexity kind of above all else. The older students, though, did notice the efforts at diversity, whether it was explicitly sort of social justice oriented content, or if it was even just diverse depictions of different cultures and characters, they noticed it. They did also comment and notice on the authenticity of those portrayals. So they did have feedback about, this felt authentic, this not so much. The younger students didn't really notice the diversity, or they didn't at least comment on it one way or the other. Not to say they didn't maybe see it, but they did not bring it up when we gave them multimodal opportunities to share what they saw. And I just have to include this, they did not react at all to non-binary pronouns. So the older students, we had them divided into middle school and lower elementary school age students. The middle school age students had an item that was about a Latinx non-binary character, and nobody said anything at all, which was particularly striking because when we reviewed this item with adults, they were very concerned about the grammar of the item and that it was very confusing, and they were worried that the kids were not going to be able to understand who was speaking, and the kids had nothing to say. They took it right in stride. And we also asked the students questions about sort of which item do you prefer? We'll go to the next slide, sorry. And sort of, what is interesting to you? What matters to you? And so again, what they really cared about was how quickly and easily they could solve the item. So things like the length, the clarity, the format. And then they also really seemed to care about how well an item matched their interests. And as a flip side of that, in terms of things that they didn't necessarily care about, it wasn't that they didn't care about diversity, but diversity was not necessarily more interesting to them than something that matched their own interests. So I'll share a few quotations in a moment, but I think they were very explicit that what I really want is to see something that reflects what I care about and what is interesting to me, not necessarily somebody who looks like me, though that's also nice. They also didn't seem to view assessment as a learning opportunity, which I think is maybe a bigger hurdle for us to think about, because I think some of the practices we're talking about are trying to sort of raise student awareness and show them sort of different cultures and viewpoints through perhaps the passages of the items. They were really concerned with, just where can I find the information to answer the item, and then I'm going to move on. So I think that's a bigger question of sort of how assessment fits into teaching, into classroom practices, but just something to flag. So just to share a few more comments that the students shared with us, we'll go to the next slide. So this is one student you can see sort of grappling with, on the one hand, diversity, on the other hand, I just really want to solve this item efficiently and quickly. So she says, I like the diversity, but I also prefer multiple choice. And so I like the second one because it's multiple choice, it's easier and straightforward. And she also says, I'm not sure tests are supposed to be fun. So a little bit of a dagger to the heart for those of us that were hoping this could be a learning opportunity. Not to say we shouldn't keep trying, but I think it just points at maybe a larger issue that we need to think about as we try to transform our assessments in this way. Next slide, another quotation. This is about, again, the tension between seeing diverse, authentic portrayals versus seeing things that match what I care about. So this was a student who had one item that was about the non-binary Latinx character engaging with a neighbor. And then that was juxtaposed with an item that was about the Apollo moon landing. And he said, at the end of the day, astronauts are just more interesting than normal people. Not to say, I didn't see it, but I would just rather read about astronauts. So again, kind of goes to that this is more than, I think, to underscore what Akuma said, this is about more than optics, but also the topics that really are going to make a difference in terms of how we kind of catch students' attention and make them feel seen. And then the last quotation I'll share, if we could sum the whole thing up, this student did it very eloquently for us. So she said, I don't know if this is a theme or not, but I would not change how interesting the questions are for diversity. I would rather read something more interesting than something I was included in. And it's enjoyable for me to read something that's interesting and less lengthy. Now, just to be clear, I don't think this is a blanket, path for us to say, see, diversity doesn't matter. But I think it does go to pointing out that this is about more than just reflecting students back to themselves or thinking that if we show someone of their race, we are reflecting them back to themselves. These students are complex people. They have ideas, they have preferences, they have things that they like. And so I think as we think about trying to represent our students, we really do need to go deeper. So just to wrap up then, in terms of where this might leave us, I think I think many of us agree here that, sorry, next slide. Representation on assessment is important, and we believe that it's going to make things more engaging for students, but what is exactly the relationship between those things? And thinking more about sort of research now and what we can do in terms of assessment research. And then what also is the relationship between that representation and performance? So how do we expect these things to sort of interact to produce a different outcome for students? And how can we sort of map out those relationships more clearly in our future research? I think it's also important to remember that ultimately we were showing kids items, but they will be seeing a full test. And so what feels like it resonates for one student on one item, we should also think about that across the complete test in terms of how often students feel seen or represented and how willing they are to sort of engage those trade-offs that, I'm not in every item, but I saw myself in a few items and that felt good. So overall, this is going to work. And then how can we increase both representation on assessments, but also engagement? And I didn't put it here, but I think just to sort of maybe state the obvious, our biggest takeaway is that it was incredibly valuable and rewarding to talk to students. And so engaging them in the review process, in the development process, as Fiona said as well, is really, I think there's a lot of really rich information that we could learn there if we can just figure out ways to build it into our process. So I'll stop there and pass it back to Jennifer, or no, to Kate, sorry.
That's right. It's good. So I loved hearing the quotes from kids, and I see folks over there too getting those student reactions. So Renaissance has also been, trying to do some work in diversifying. Started with trying to diversify our content staff, but say in the interim, right, we've got to diversify our content with the staff that we have. And so one of the first steps that we've been doing is sort of an audit and a tagging of our content for key areas of representation. And again, just wanted to show sort of here's some of real world what we're doing and how we're thinking about it. So the next slide is just a graphic from one of our practice products, straight image audit. What do we have? And we found that, a little more than half our content represented white characters and our females were more represented than our males. And so doing this type of audit gives us information to figure out how we need to prioritize what this distribution looks like and what we want to do in future development. So as we go to the next slide, we acknowledge that increasing the diversity is going to take time, and it takes additional research from our teams to do it correctly. As Molly said, we don't want to do stereotypes. We want to, validate, celebrate different types of culture. And so that takes time. And so we're prioritizing different groups in different iterations of development. And next, so we're working with internal employees, we're working with external research and really trying to get to that accurate, positive representation of students from different backgrounds and cultures within our assessment. And so one of the things that we did was just analyze how long does that take? If we're adding in this research step, what's the impact of that compared to a regular item development? So on the next slide, just some quantitative and qualitative results from that. If you want to flip, we've got in reading, we found a slight increase in the amount of time it took to develop an item, about 30%. We're kind of more used to those types of context items in reading. In math, it took twice as long or a little longer to develop those math items. So that was a significant increase compared to typical approaches. Did not really see a different pattern by grade level. But as the team talked about the challenges in math, they said, as much of half of our time in development was just spent researching to really feel confident about the context and, that we're being appropriate. And as we're trying to add in these other vocabulary to what Akuma talked about earlier, like those are words that might be challenging. And so we're now working with our ELA team to say, are these appropriate words for our elementary students? Should they be able to understand the word? Do we need to provide additional context or definition? And so there's a lot more collaboration then across the math and the ELA teams, which overall adds to that increase as well. So obviously, as we continue these efforts, we hope to build efficiencies into the process. But changing the way we rate items does take time. And so, we have to acknowledge that it impacts the number of items that we can create in any given time period as we're trying to do this work and trying to bring in things that are outside of maybe what we've had before. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you. So with our last question for the afternoon, how should assessment designers revise practices to ensure cultural responsiveness? I'm going to start with you, Chastity.
Yes. So in thinking about my response to this question, I wanted to tie it back to the original 3 tenets because I think it's important to keep coming back to the theoretical foundation. I do think there are some things we can commit to doing today based on our current understanding of best practices, and then also commit to investigating further in order to advance our understanding of those best practices. Today, we can work on developing culturally competent students. To reiterate, cultural competence refers to helping students appreciate and celebrate their cultures while learning about other cultures. So to do this, we'll have to revise our content guidelines to provide room for other cultures so that we're no longer centering one. Currently, these guidelines tend to focus on what we don't include in assessments to avoid biasing one cultural group over another. But now that we've learned today, there's no such thing as culture neutral, culture blind, or culture free. It's time we shift from focusing solely on removing culture specific content to intentionally including culture rich content that allows more students to see themselves uplifted. And this is an example of a math item that targets this tenet. It's from Freckled by Renaissance. And technically it's a practice problem, but it can be easily revised to be made into an assessment item, especially the picture on the right here. So we read and can see that the main character is a Latina. In fact, she's a curly-haired Afro-Latina who is an entrepreneur and owns her own bakery. Then we go into a typical math problem, but we're not using pizza pies, we're using culturally relevant foods. And these are the subtle affirmations that increase feelings of inclusion and show students they belong. But like I said earlier, this is not where it ends. Ladson Billings reminds us that surface level diversity, adding people of color and diverse images isn't sufficient. There's more to it than that. So we have to look to the other 2 tenets to understand how to truly develop relevant and responsive assessments. Looking forward, we'll have to check our assumptions about how academic achievement should look on an assessment. We appreciate the efficiency and convenience of standardization, but if we're truly trying to assess what students know as opposed to what they don't know, then we must build assessments that give students the opportunity to put their best foot forward. We'll have to reimagine the format of assessments if we want them to be culturally responsive. And lastly, it's imperative that we explore the role socio-political consciousness plays in assessments. I keep coming back to this. If this tenet gets dropped from instruction frequently, then it's safe to say it almost never appears on traditional assessments. But we owe it to our students to at least explore if there's a place in assessments to develop civic engagement. The call to action here is to conduct more research exploring the types of developmentally appropriate topics that would fit this tenet. And then from there, gather evidence demonstrating how students react to these types of topics and gather data showing the impact this has on student performance, if it has any. I'm reminded of Jennifer Randall's note that Our current guidelines are rooted in fear. That really stuck with me. And we can't allow this to cause inaction. Our trepidation around implementing this tenet makes it the heaviest lift of all 3 tenets. But I strongly believe our response should be to investigate it further and not abandon it completely. So here's an example of how an item may look when implementing that 3rd tenet. Again, this is a problem from Freckle. And here if you read along, you'll see that we have someone who lives in a food desert and wanted to help her community. So she reached out to her city and they transformed a vacant lot into a community garden, and then insert the math problem. And that's it. So remember, the objective of developing socio-political consciousness is to help students understand the systems impacting their lives in order to empower them to improve their communities. And this is how it can be displayed in an assessment item. We just have to commit to exploring the best ways to do it. Next slide. Because if we don't lead with equity, as some very smart scholars have noted, if we don't lead with equity when developing assessments, we'll continue privileging certain types of learning, hindering the validation of multiple means of demonstration, and reinforcing the false notion that some students don't belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Chastity. Fiona?
Thank you. So building on what Katie and Chastity talked about in terms of the challenges of developing diverse content, and also the practice of criteria that specifically identifies what we should not do or what we should not include. Those considerations, as well as the quote regarding Jennifer Randall, the guidelines are rooted in fear. I think that reimagining our bias and sensitivity practice and criteria is important for us to be able to understand and consider specifically the students that we serve. The criteria certainly is a guide also for content developers who are creating items that need to pass through the bias and sensitivity committee approval process. And so taking another look at this particular practice and perhaps expanding the criteria with a focus on inclusion and culturally relevant items could be integrated as a part of the review committee's understanding of their expectations and role within the bias and sensitivity review practice. One of the things that we have been revisiting at Cognia is the framework in terms of how the bias and sensitivity criteria is informing the content and eliminating authors of color and eliminating content that would be more representative. And so reframing this review process to ensure an equity mindset throughout the committee members and their review of the items is essential to supporting a practice from the beginning of content development to the end of it moving through the committee review process. And one of the things that we have been considering is the members who participate in the bias and sensitivity review process, and even changing the name of this committee to an equity advisory panel, so that the focus is on supporting equitable practice in the items and content and throughout the review process, and to leverage an equity mindset that supports cultural relevance and inclusion, and this being based and on an intentional practice for considering the students, considering who they are, considering once again their culture, their identity, and placing cultural relevance at the forefront of our work as we begin development, and with the consideration of the process that that item development moves through as we engage our equity advisory panel members to specifically support a context for identification of equity and cultural relevance within the item sets that are being reviewed.
Thank you so very much, Fiona and Akuma.
All right, I'm gonna wrap us up, I guess, before we turn it back over to some questions with sort of the call to action. So we've heard about cultural competence a lot in the context of students and wanting to make sure we're building up their cultural competence. But we need to make sure that those who are teaching them to be culturally competent are also culturally competent themselves. So what does that actually look like? And it's fundamentally accepting, I think, something we've heard from almost everybody here, that there's no such thing as a colorblind assessment, right? So the idea that no matter how much you're trying to neutralize and normalize the assessment, cultures in there, what do I have to actually do to be able to do this? So there's first the understanding of understanding your own culture, right? Beginning at the most basic level, but as I think I saw in one of the chats, understanding it at a mastery level so that you do not monolithically treat certain groups of individuals, right? We don't want to say that, well, all Latin students are going to believe this or all Black students are going to feel this way. So really understanding the intricacies of your own culture and therefore the cultures of others. The willingness to learn about cultural practices and worldviews, positive attitudes towards cultural differences. And the reason we emphasize the idea of positive is, unfortunately, when we learn about a lot of non-white cultures in America, we start at the negative, right? We start talking about Black culture at slavery. We start talking about Latinx culture when we took over Mexico. We talk about like just indigenous erasure and wanting to talk about what predated colonization, right? Let's make sure we think about these people holistically. So what are the positive attitudes about the culture that has helped overcome any of the difficulties that have happened in your life as an adult and would translate to those students? And then that readiness to accept that culture. And it sounds funny to say there has to be a readiness to accept it, but you actually have to be ready to implement it in the classroom. And why we say that that's important is often in doing a lot of this work, you'll come up against biases, implicit and explicit. And are you ready to actually accept some of those biases? Are you ready to challenge privilege? And me always explaining to people that white privilege doesn't mean your life may not have been difficult. It just means race wasn't a factor in that difficulty, right? So the individualization of individual difficulties versus systemic things that may have caused difficulties for individuals. And that's understanding a deep cultural context in this. And one of the best ways that has been put out there to build up your own cultural competence is building a learning community, right? So it's changing what we think about professional learning, PLCs. Instead of looking at our instruction and our assessments, are we just leaning into discomfort, being vulnerable, and really growing in who we are? Because that personal has to predate the instructional changes that would then lead to the assessment changes. So it's really beginning with that you work and undoing your own biases so you can develop your cultural competence. Therefore, you're more equipped to do this for your students who have probably not been empowered in this way, especially if you do not have the same racial affinity of your students. So with that, I will toss it back to Jennifer.
Thank you, Akuma. Thank you, thank you. Well, we want to thank all of you for your participation this afternoon and giving us your ear. And now I want to open it up to my colleagues, the expert panelists here, to just respond to some of the questions in our Q&A. So I'll stop sharing here. So we have one question. Do you guys want to just attack them, or would you like me to just kind of call out the questions for you? All right, so we'll start with, we have, this question was posed to Katie and Molly. Thank you for addressing the language aspects of testing. One of the objections my organization often receives is our tests of language do not account for the language differences of particularly Black examinees, but also other examinees of color. How do we encourage examiners and raters to implement UDA into scoring responses to assessments of language ability while still providing them a standardized set of acceptable responses?
I'm happy to take the first swing at that one, Katie, if that's okay. So I think this actually ties back to sort of, I guess, two things. So first of all, clear definition of the construct, just to echo one of the UDA principles that's already been raised. So It helps to start by saying, what do we care about? What are we really measuring here? And what does that include and what does that not include? And when it comes to language, I think it involves being explicit. Do we care if all the verbs are conjugated correctly, or are we really trying to see if the student can communicate an idea? And if that's the case, you can also then add, in terms of your scoring, explicit examples of, here's something that may not look like standard English that is an excellent answer because it meets the standards for the item to show them, so you should not be paying attention to that. And you can even say in your scoring directions, the following should not be counted or considered for this score point, or in terms of how you evaluate. So I think just being super explicit and also providing examples that if your raters are having trouble, understanding how non-standard dialects manifest, show them, here are some examples of responses at each score point that do have sort of these different linguistic profiles that absolutely meet the score point that we're asking you to rate for.
Yeah, as I read the question, I was thinking about it, it reminded me of some of the early work we had to do in training scorers to score typewritten responses as opposed to handwritten responses. There was sort of this implicit bias that typewritten responses would be more of a final product. And so they were more likely to count off for grammar and some of these other mistakes. And we had to have very clear, conversations with the scorers about some of these potential for biases and show, again, the examples like Molly said. So I think we've got some, precedent for really helping scorers understand differences and making them aware of those things that can impact their scoring that really aren't relevant to whether the student understands and is demonstrating the knowledge that was asked.
And I'd like to jump in because this question reminds me of something that we encountered recently with one of our products that assesses early literacy for preschool students. And I remember there being a picture of a slipper, and some students were responding that it's a house shoe and not a slipper. And the question came up of whether this should be considered correct or not. So I think we have to make sure that we are norming our what do we consider acceptable responses, and that we're also making sure that those norming samples are diverse and consider students from different geographical regions, different races and cultures, because we're all speaking about the same element, the same house slipper, whether it's a shoe or a slipper. So I think that's something that needs to be considered as well.
Okay, and the next question for any panelist: how do we better design assessments in areas such as crystallized intelligence, which are by definition culture bound? Should we be questioning why we assess this in the first place?
I'm not sure if there's anyone on our panel that has a lot of background in sort of crystallized intelligence. So I'll start for a second if anyone else wants to add in. Just to say, I do think again, for me, it's the purpose of the assessment. So why are you assessing? Why are you including the knowledge that you are? And there actually has been a lot of movement in general intelligence testing towards trying to look at nonverbal measures and spatial measures and some of these other things that can show different types of intelligence that can be used to help identify students from a variety of backgrounds. And there's a lot of controversy in our field in general about sort of measurement of intelligence, but I think there are definitely areas where folks have been trying to move forward and trying to look at, if the purpose is identifying, if the purpose, right, is the purpose identifying students that need additional services in school? Is it, identifying students that need a different kind of challenge, making sure that our assessment that we give actually matches the purpose and then the intended action that we expect to take based on it.
I think my addition to that, and wanting to make sure we've made that clear, is that culture and race are not synonymous, right? So there's this idea of you can test for culture as long as you're not automatically stereotyping that to a race. Whereas a particular culture grows out of a racial background, that culture can then take over an entire region, as the example that I gave, that even if we weren't Latinx people still spoke with like random words in an area of the country that you may be in. I taught in Atlanta, it didn't matter the race of the kids, they all use like Black Southern slang. So understand understanding that when you know the culture of an area, see if it is actually superseding the racial area, because then you are potentially testing for your entire student population if that culture has become very much a way of understanding the intelligence of those students, and that you're not automatically associating this culture with that race, because that is when we then come up with monolithic things. A Black person in Atlanta does not sound like a Black person in Oakland, right? But the white people in Oakland may sound like the Black people in Oakland. So understanding that culture gets tied to region a lot more than it can get tied to race, especially in Gen Z.
All right, let's take another one. Related to your emphasis on practice, and again, anyone on the panel here, which I like, what are the ways in which a culturally responsive test can create a score, a number, that a teacher or parent or policymaker uses in a culturally unresponsive or non-responsive, anti-responsive, or outright racist way? If this is possible, or perhaps in some cases likely, should we ban the use of the term culturally responsive test and instead use the term culturally responsive test use?
Yes. I think I really like this question. I think it is, you're pushing us to think about the consequences of test use, which I think we would probably agree that in our current paradigm, tests that we think are neutral, that we hoped were neutral, do get used, I think, to sometimes perpetuate, I want to say racist, but sometimes they are just, ideas about different races, particularly because we always insist on reporting things differentiated by racial groups. So it is important. I almost feel like I don't want to actually call tests culturally responsive. I want them to be culturally responsive, but I don't know that that's necessarily something we should spend a lot of energy trumpeting about. We should, just put them out in the world. And then, yes, I think the use and ensuring that that is responsive is maybe the harder work and the more important work. So yes, that's my answer.
All right, the next question is for Molly. What was the purpose of the assessments you were asking students about? Were they more intended to provide feedback to students, teachers for learning, or more for grading? Would the purpose impact whether students say them as a learning experience?
Saw them as a learning experience. Yeah, that's a great question. So these were they were items that were loosely for a benchmark, kind of a through course assessment. So they were designed to support kind of classroom level decision making as opposed to large scale summative. But they did also kind of look like large scale summative assessments. We didn't actually share any of that with the students. So we really just said, here's a test item, what do you think? And so I think they were just reacting to what they saw. But I think also, kind of what you're getting at is, and I think something that our partners are grappling with is, to what extent can the test be a learning experience? And also, how much does it depend on what the students are used to seeing in their instruction and their classroom experience before they get to the test? And these partners are, thinking broadly about also curricular materials. They're working in a number of different areas, but they, one of the things is if we're going to do this for our curriculum, it would be nice if our assessments could reflect that in some way. And how do we do that for assessment? And so, it could be that maybe we're more limited for those kinds of assessments, or maybe we just need to think differently. But I do think if we want students to see assessment content as an opportunity to perhaps, view other cultures, to learn about, social justice issues, then we probably still do, I think, need to do some work to shift how they view assessments, which also is about how adults view and use assessments.
All right, as we think about cultural relevance in the context of testing, someone just added another question. In the context of testing, are we making an assumption that test scores or the procedures we use to produce test scores are valued by all cultures in which our test taker students are raised? And if this assumption does not hold, should we invest in deepening understanding of what types of evidence of learning are valued by various cultures and working the folks of the culture to develop methods for collecting that evidence, in addition, rather than investing in modifications that aim to increase the cultural relevance of test item content? Asked differently, to what extent is our effort to develop culturally relevant items undergirded by white, racially framed assumptions about testing?
I think one of the pieces here that to me is inherent in that question, again, comes back to like the purposes and use. And One thing that we didn't have time to get into today, but at one point I talked about sort of high stakes summative, right, which is where I used to work. Now I'm sort of in like a more interim space, and then there's classroom formative. And again, as we think about who the test is for and who's going to use it, I think that does drive some of those decisions. So as you were talking about, you know, do we change the test or do we see what people value? I think there's probably more room to see what people value the closer you get to the classroom, because again, of the use and of the people that are using it.
Right. In the recent NAEP and NAGB reading framework debate, some framework panelists and board members implied that adopting sociocultural theory and test development would cause achievement gaps to appear smaller. Do you think this is likely or possible? If it is likely or possible, is that a reason to adopt culturally responsive test development practices or not adopt these practices?
I think it's very likely, and there have been some studies, and the researchers, I can't think of their names right now, but I'll definitely pull them up after this. But there have been some studies showing the achievement gap or the appearance of the achievement gap almost disappearing when you implement culturally responsive assessment practices. It hasn't been done, or at least I haven't seen it at the large scale. It was mostly for classroom-based assessments as well as maybe grade-based assessments or school-based, but there's definitely research suggesting that adopting these practices will minimize the appearance of the achievement gap.
All right, next, how might we implement these principles in licensure and certification testing where there is a dominant culture associated with the profession itself?
I sort of feel like a broken record on this, but I feel like it comes back to sort of the point that Katie and I have been sort of taking turns making about defining the construct and then defining, you know, how you want to measure it and score it. So I would say in licensure and certification, as in education, you know, you should start with the question of what matters for this field. Does it matter that the practitioner can communicate with their client somehow, or is it very important that they communicate with their client in a certain way? And that, you know, the way that you might transform the certification assessment should build from that. So if there are certain things where, you know, it's a very important safety feature for this to be done in a certain way or with a certain kind of language or culture, then, you know, by all means, build that into the construct and the test. But if we just happen to do it that way and haven't necessarily thought very hard about how important it is that it be associated with a particular language or culture, then I think there is room to possibly, you know, think about some changes and reforms. That's my instinct.
Plug for the program that I did my licensure through, because we sort of had to do it. So USC's teacher certification program, in acknowledging that the majority of their student body was going to be Spanish speaking, required you to actually take TESOL classes, whether you were going to be teaching students in that way or not. Because what we would often notice, especially during my student teaching program, is the minute teaching stopped, when students were communicating with each other, they switched back to speaking in Spanish. So it was our way of making sure that we could always be involved in the learning that was happening in the classroom, even if we weren't the direct instructors in that moment. So that's a one direct way of, they literally just threw in that requirement. And then when I transferred to teaching in Atlanta, didn't necessarily matter as much, but for those few students I had who were like immigrants, they loved the fact that I could understand cultural references. So it is just as simple as making it a requirement, right? And it didn't matter what you were teaching. So even if you were getting a science certification, you still had to get the TESOL certificate. So typically it was just added on as a certificate attachment to it, but they made it part of the program. And to give us sort of that experiential learning of being a fish out of water, the thing I remember the most about the classroom of the student experience for myself was we were made to watch a lot of telenovelas, right? So they're like, you're going to learn it authentically, one, that you'll learn the actual conversational Spanish, but two, understand how it may feel for a student who doesn't have your native language and they're trying to keep up. So it's really just embedded into our curriculum to not only mimic what the student experience was, but to understand what conversational Spanish was going to look like versus what you probably learned in school. Because if you probably noticed, there were students who were Spanish speaking who struggled in Spanish class because they were learning a very formal version of the language. So it's really just directly integrating a TESOL certificate into most licensure programs.
Okay, the next question is posed to Katie. What if the student target population is overwhelmingly a single race? And this was someone following up to Jody's question from earlier.
Yeah, so there's a question earlier about, I had shown the image audit and sort of the percentages in different categories. And the question is like, what is your target? How do you know what to do? And we've talked about that internally a lot about our targets, and sort of said we were going to set our targets on the student population. So not a total US population or the adult population, but we wanted to reflect the students that we serve. And so I think here, again, depending on what the assessment is and what that population, not totally conflating race and culture, which we talked about a minute ago, but our goal was for students to be able to see themselves in assessment. And if you then also want them to have some of those outside experiences, the idea of windows and mirrors, you would include both of those things in your assessment. But the first part that we've been talking about is, being able to value, affirm, and for students to see themselves inside the assessment. And so if your target population, is overwhelmingly one group, I would make sure that that group is included in what you are doing.
Yes, and just going back to those tenets of building cultural competence, it's not just about seeing yourself, but also learning about the cultures of others. So, I grew up in the Bronx, and I was around mostly Black and other Latino students, but I still learned of other cultures. It's not just a mirror that we're trying to present, it's windows into other nationalities, other races, other groups of people that you wouldn't normally encounter.
Okay. The next question, what are suggestions for creating or adopting modules for teachers to learn and receive feedback on culturally responsive assessment practices?
I think that one of the things in terms of supporting teachers with understanding culturally responsive practices is, obviously there's a ton of information around what cultural responsiveness is. However, I also think that when we want to understand our students and when we want to understand our students and the communities that they're from, I think that it's important as a part of the practice to ask questions specifically and to understand specifically who our students are, what their identities are, what communities they come from, and the cultural context in which they live and relate to. And I think that there are ways that teachers and schools and systems can support understanding context with the kinds of communications and feedback and authentically engaging with parents and students in the community around cultural context, around their experiences with learning, and around with the connections and disconnections that they have within the context for learning in the classroom.
I would add, look at the words that were used there. So I got very stuck on the word module, because the idea of a module is that I can complete it, right? So I know this, right? There's a right and a wrong, and there's a binary there. And one of the things I mentioned during building your cultural competence is a learning community. And that comes from really thinking about the binary of perfectionism versus a culture of learning. So there's no real, we're gonna create a module, but think of it more as can we create a group, right? Can we create a community of practice, a professional learning community, and we're working with each other, we're working with students to continually building our ability in this, and think of it as more of an ongoing learning as opposed to a module and I've hit proficiency. And I described it more as there's going to be basic and there's mastery. And if we're acknowledging that mastery of most topics can take 10 years, treat this with that same kind of intensity, that you're not going to just know your students' culture. It's going to take you about a decade of time. And how long is that going to happen? So can you really develop a module for that? Or do you treat it more of a long-term practice that you're going to have to engage in with your colleagues?
And I think of the work that Katie referenced earlier, where some members on the content team of the STAR assessments, they've been doing deep dives into different cultures for the sake of representing them authentically and appropriately. But it's not a checklist of things to include or things to say, things not to say. It's really just the experience. There's really no end goal there, or no way to know that you've checked it all off. You just embark on this journey of understanding other cultures and develop your own cultural competence. Yeah.
So with that, I think we're going to need to wrap up. And I want to really thank Katie, Akuma, Chastity, Jennifer, Fiona, Molly for a very thought-provoking webinar. It's given us a lot to consider and think about and work on as a community. This was the first, what I hope will be a now annual event that we'll have. And I would also want to just say up front that we are planning to follow this up with additional series of webinars that will continue to focus on equity. Ye Tong and colleagues will be coordinating that, so you have that to look forward to. Hopefully in the next few months, we'll have more of those coming your way. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you very much all.